Here we go. Right, we're on.
Morning, old feed.
Let's go, Mike.
I'm listening to you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're live, aye.
Okay, you're live. I'm live. We chose a theme for today, which I want to follow up on in more detail later. But every March you've been on, every March I've been on, every March, every Yes family's been on. There's always one definite chant shouted out. What do you want?
Independence.
When do you want it?
Now.
And the theme for today, Dave, is how are we going to get it? How do the Yes movement cause the revolution that's necessary to get independence for this country before anything else can happen? We've got to achieve that.
Yep.
I chose a film theme for the last catch-up we had, Back to the Future. And that still has its part to play in this, but I chose Groundhog Day. Most people, I think, will have seen the film. Every morning you wake up to exactly the same thing happening over and over and over until something changes, until the main character in the film changes. He suddenly realizes, it's a bit like reincarnation, if you like. There's a Buddhist theme in that film. He suddenly realizes nothing's going to change unless he changes. And I think that's the basic truth to what's happening about independence. Nothing will change. We can chant as much as we like, but until the Yes movement makes the changes that I think are necessary, and everything I'm going to say is a very personal view in this, may not meet with everyone's approval, but that's the way I've come to think about it all. I'm going to start with something that relates to Boris Johnson. And apologies to you, Dave, for raising Boris Johnson up. I'll use two words that as affects Boris Johnson. Some people will see him as an absolute opportunist. He'll do what's necessary at the time to try and achieve what his goal is. Now, our goal is independence. Sorry?
That's not the two words I would use.
Okay, well, let's use liar. Does he lie? And I'm going to share a page with you during the course of today. This is the page. I'm going to take you to the top. We had a general election, Dave, in December 2019. And unless something very dramatic happens, we're in a fixed term parliament. Now, there is gossip that might change, but I'm going to work in the theme that we know at the moment. We've got 5 years of Boris Johnson. The Scottish Conservative Manifesto, not a lot of the Yes movement will have read it. I read it. And that first bit is what Boris Johnson said in the foreword. If the outcome of this election is a strong Conservative majority government, we can tick that box. That's exactly what he achieved. Then I can guarantee we will reject any request from the SNP government to hold an independence referendum. Won't be any negotiation. We'll just say no. Because we already made our decision 5 years ago. 2 million Scots said no to independence. And then he addresses Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon promised you this was once in a generation decision, and I will hold her to that. And I won't share that any longer, but I'll come back to that page later, Dave. So here's my question. There'll be no marches in 2020. Let's hope the marches start again in 2021. And we hear the chant, what do you want? Independence. When do you want it? Now. You then have to think what Boris Johnson has said. He's guaranteeing, no matter how often you chant that, no matter how often you ask for an independence referendum, he's given a guarantee. 2021, you're on the march. 2022, you're on the march. 2023, this is Groundhog Day, Dave. Boris is going to stick with no. He's got absolutely no reason to say yes. And given the effect of the virus on the economy, he's got more excuses other than just saying Nicola and Alex said once in a generation. I mean, no, all know that's been taken out of context. Boris will exploit that and everything else. All he has to do is say no. So something has got to change.
Well, the way I'm seeing that is like if we allow Boris Johnson, the UK government, to actually say what we can do, then we don't deserve to be independent. Because at the end of the day, if we're asking for permission to do it, what I'd like to do is take you to a member of the SNP at the moment and a member of the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah.
And this is a little bit of what she said in 2012. And it's a very short piece, but there.
Shows. Now we have our own mechanism in the Scottish Parliament, but we don't need to have a Parliament. Even if this didn't exist, and the Scottish people were to scream out onto the streets of our towns and cities, into our villages, on megaphone, on marches, online, and say with a clear voice, they wanted an independent Scotland again, that would be a declaration of independence and no challenge from the Palace of Westminster, nor the corridors of the United Nations, or this place, nor any courts could gainsay it. The Scottish people would say they've done it, and they've done it their way.
That was Christine Graham.
That was Christine Graham in 2012 in the Scottish Parliament. It's actually part of a longer speech that she did, First Minister's Questions at the time. Basically, this is a member of the party that is saying we should pursue the gold standard at the moment.
Yeah.
You'll notice I've made a few posts recently. The gold standard is basically 100 years out of date. They got rid of it because it didn't work. It wasn't effective for the world that they were living in, as is the present gold standard that Nicola Sturgeon is chasing. But as I say, Christine Graham, what she said has not changed, no matter whether the policies of the SNP have changed or whatever. Christine Graham said if we go out onto the streets and demand, or not even demand, take independence, that's all we've got to do. We've just got to do it in big enough numbers.
Later on, Dave, we're going to take that into greater detail. But can I make a suggestion to you?
Yep.
Because you know that clip well,
yep.
And it's what we're looking at are how are we going to get independence? Now, Christine Graham is making one suggestion in that clip.
Yep.
Can I suggest for the people that will be watching this afterwards, play the clip again, Dave, so that people can listen to what she's saying? If you can manage that.
Parliament, but we don't need to have a Parliament. Even if this didn't exist, and the Scottish people were to scream out onto the streets of our towns and cities, into our villages, on megaphone, on marches, online, and say with a clear voice, they wanted an independent Scotland again, that would be a declaration of independence and no challenge from the Palace of Westminster, nor the corridors of the United Nations, or this place, nor any courts could gainsay it. The Scottish people would say they've done it, and they've done it their way.
There you have it. No court, no parliament, nobody, no Boris Johnson can do anything about it. And basically, I believe, I was hoping that the SNP would be able to supply a way forward to be able to get it. They've tried, not hard enough in my opinion, but they've tried, and they're getting nowhere with it. At the end of the day, what we do is the people are sovereign, the Parliament are not, the Scottish Government are not, the MSPs are not, the people are. If the people go out and say, look, we are doing it, as I say, you're aware of the petition that I put in at Holyrood, at Westminster a year and a half ago, that they came back and said we can't deal with that because independence or dissolution of the union is a matter for the Scottish people, not for Westminster. That I got from Angela Leadsom. that's still available. And the bottom line is that's what it is. The people, I hate saying we the people, but the people have more power than the First Minister of Scotland and the whole Scottish Government, because we are not prisoner under the Scotland Act.
Comes back, Dave, to something not long after 2014. You started to see the three words hope over fear appear. And that was quite right. A lot of people were scared in 2014 as to how they might be affected individually, not as a group, but individually. I think we've got to change the hope over fear to action over hope. It goes back to my Groundhog Day analogy. It's not until something changes, and that's got to come from the yes movement. It ties in with what Christine Graham is saying. It ties in with what you've just said. It's when the yes movement get together in common purpose and take action that will lead to independence without permission from anyone, just by a mass agreement. We're not going to march for the next 5 years asking for permission when we already know that for every one of those years, for every one of the months in those years, Boris Johnson has a simple 2-letter word to say, which is no. It's the wrong way to go. One of the fears, I think, that we have in having this discussion, I raised it with you earlier this week when we had a chat. There's a huge thing going on just now because of COVID-19. We're all totally and utterly aware of it. So is it right to take action on independence in the middle of that? Two thoughts I have on that is, number one, Brexit is not going to stop because of the virus. Brexit is going ahead, whatever its eventual outcome, a hard Brexit or a negotiated Brexit, that is still going to happen. And what the virus has taught us very simply is that there's also another danger lurking around, which is climate change. Climate change, the climate we have, is not going to alter because we stop speaking and stop taking action. I'm very much, and I hope this discussion between you and I leads to a small group of people, even, doesn't have to be a big group, who can influence on the type of action that's maybe required. It depends, I think, from my perspective, if you've got an agenda, how high up on that agenda is the word independence, action to achieve that independence. But second place, for instance, I watched, very interested in Yes for EU this morning. They did a similar thing, Zoom, and they did it very, very well. To me, anything to do with the discussion of the EU, EFTA or nothing, and people have different views on this, comes after independence. It cannot come before, right? So that, if it's anywhere, has got to come below that. You need, first thing is a goal, and that's got to be the word independence. The next thing you need is a strategy, whatever it is, and that's what we're going to discuss. And then you need tactics. Those three things are what's involved in this. Now, I'm going to jump for a second. You and I are doing these catch-ups, but we're also hoping to have guests. Now, a person I know you are in touch with at the moment is Craig Murray.
Yep.
You want to just talk through your discussions with Craig Murray and why it's important, and we hope to have a Zoom meeting with him, maybe pre-recorded, to make sure we don't do anything dodgy.
Definitely.
Over to you, my friend.
Well, as I say, like I spent time with Craig when we were at the Alex Salmond trial, and I'd got to speak to him like on quite a lot of things. And the strangest thing was, before we went in that day, he'd been talking about having been doing it the Julian Assange thing a couple of weeks before, and he said it was heartbreaking seeing him like standing in this sort of glass screened off box with the weight of the British state on him. And he said, and Alex got the same, although it's a slightly more humane box he's sitting in. And he turned around and says to me, he says, I would absolutely hate to be in that position myself when I've got the weight of the state coming on me. And now he has, because basically Mr. Prentice QC and Deputy Advocate Deputy seems to be going all out to take people of one side of the argument out, and it's not just Craig Murray. There are others, quite a well-known person whose name I'm not going to give just now. But there are things happening with that, and basically Craig has made his defence fund available to defend anyone who gets into trouble as far as that particular situation is concerned. So anyway, I spoke to him earlier on the week, and he's going to come on. He's going to do an interview. Now the thing is, it'll probably be quite long for one thing, so we might do it in two parts. But his case is going to be very interesting. I don't know if he's noticed the last couple of days, he took some of the money for the crowdfunder and did a poll, an opinion poll, where he actually asked, panel base asked 115,000 people if they knew any of the people in the Alex Salmond case, any of the protected witnesses, the alphabet woman as it get called, and if they did, where did they get their information, and the information that they got wasn't enough to actually identify any of them from it, and the results of that were absolutely incredible. Basically, although it's no defence for Craig to say that everybody else did it as well, he's been charged with supplying pieces of a jigsaw, and he may have supplied maybe one piece according to the poll, if you're being generous to the prosecution. But Danny Garavelli, she said that her piece was lawyered twice. I think those lawyers are going to be getting lawyered as well at the moment. So hopefully we're going to hear from Craig maybe in the next week or two.
Oh, I saw the poll. The other thing that stuck out for me was the fact that they listed most of the newspapers.
Yep.
And how many of them had given information that allowed people to put the jigsaw together.
Well, it was mostly the Scotsman in Scotland on Sunday. That was where the Garavelli piece was.
Yeah.
So I think there were 7 people, or 7 people had said either Danny Garavelli or Scotland on Sunday, and there were only 82 people in the poll that actually said that they recognised people from the media. So basically, that's 10%. But when you work that 10% out, that's 35,000 people across Scotland actually know about it through Danny Garavelli or the Scotsman or Scotland on Sunday, which then puts it into sort of, it gets to a certain point where it's public knowledge. You put me onto the Spycatcher thing a week or so ago, and I went and checked it out, and basically Spycatcher was banned in the UK by the High Court in England, and it was then published abroad. And then the stuff that was in it became public knowledge, and then the High Court here said, "Well, it's now out." So basically, so they took back the court order to stop publication. Although the guy who wrote it never got any money off it through UK sales, but I don't think that bothered him all that much. I don't think it bothered Craig either.
The bottom line to that is the fact that you have a kind of side of the court system where when I say side, what I mean. There's a police involvement. There's a lawyer involvement, advocate involvement, and then eventually there's a court of session involvement. That's all one side of things. So if that's working properly and you're saying, right, we think Craig Murray did something wrong, whether he did or didn't, that's what to be decided.
Yeah.
If you then find out that, sorry, there's other people who have done the same thing, maybe differently, maybe in a different place, maybe with a wider readership when it comes to, if newspapers have still got a wider readership, but if you follow me, if that then gets retweeted, if it then gets circulated, you sit down and say, well, wait a minute, if we think something's gone wrong and we need to make a judgment on it, you've got to make the judgment against everyone. Well, I think it was Craig Murray's blog that said this about, you can't use the defence if you were robbing a bank and get caught, that some other person was robbing the bank at the same time. But if that's the case, you arrest the other person as well, then you both go to court.
You would expect so, you would question the motives of the people behind it. That's what, definitely. But I think more for that point of view is Like, I was actually there when Sky News put out something hoping to be able to get Nicola Sturgeon because we'd only just come out of the case, and James Matthews said something to camera about the meeting at Nicola's house on Easter Monday in 2018. And I thought at the time, whoa, that's a bit brave. Because, yeah. And I can't say any more about it than that, but I thought, oh, he could be in trouble for that one. And but I've gone looking for that video everywhere to try and get it to Craig Murray for his defence. Guess what? It's nowhere to be found. So Sky's lawyers obviously know what he said as well.
You see, that's where you get into. If you're going to tackle one person for doing something, you've got to look at everyone else that may or may not have done it. And when I talked about sides, the peculiar thing, well, not peculiar, for me, the most worrying thing is because this is contempt of court, there isn't a jury involved.
No.
Right? It's one judge who's going to make a decision in this, and you're back to sides again. My interest in having Craig Murray on is actually slightly different from that. That's obviously going to be part of what we're talking about. But two things. Number one, Peter Bell recently took issue with the words UDI or the letters UDI, right? And said he was willing to accept them, but really it was, and Peter did his usual dissection of why UDI wasn't maybe appropriate, as only Peter could do. But Craig is pushing for that, and that's one of the alternatives we'll come to in due course. The second thing, and there's not many people maybe know this, Dave, you know it, and a few other people know it, and there are some people following on a page I run called X Squared, which is, I've got a petition currently lodged in the Parliament. Because the petitions committee are affected by the virus, no one is actually going to, I think we're about next in line for the next committee meeting, but they're kind of postponed and in abeyance at the moment. But one of the things I raise in that is that the Referendums Act, which the Scottish Parliament passed, may be open to challenge under two things, the Scotland Act 1998 and the Human Rights Act. Now, I know no one more than Craig Murray who takes an interest in human rights. He mentioned Section 6 in his blog, and that's the thing. Now, the reason I raise that at the moment is I'd like Craig to maybe take a view in what I've said in the petition. Ignore everything I did. I did a series of videos courtesy of David McGowan where I went through how you can fix a voting system. I didn't deal with IDOCs in great detail. I know you follow it. Daniel Thu follows it. I'm doing it a different way. I've got other ways of suggesting how it can be done. But the bottom line to it is at the end of it, I said we've got to query something, which is what's called Section 39 of this Referendum Scotland Act. And other than the number of weeks that are mentioned in it, and I won't go on for too long about this, it's identical to what was in the act which allowed us the referendum in 2014. Now, ignore everything I've said in this. You've got a thing in Holyrood called SPICE. It's where MSPs can get research material. And the senior researcher for SPICE has put a bit on the page for my petition. And what she says is if there's a default between the Scotland Act and the Human Rights Act, the Act itself, the whole of the Act, not just the wee section I'm using, can be declared unlawful. It can be struck down. Assume for a second that the Parliament passed it, the ministers passed it, it went before the Lord Advocate, the presiding officer said it's okay for royal assent. That's a lot of people. Assume for a second this idiot has decided it needs to be addressed. And I'm right. Assume that it is unlawful if you don't get those two bits done properly. And I don't think they have been done properly. It leads on to a fairly big bombshell. Because Section 39 in the current Referendums Act is virtually identical in the way it's written to what was in the Referendums Act, which allowed us in 2014. If one is unlawful, the other one was unlawful. And that takes us into the fact that if that is the case, maybe we haven't had a referendum yet. If anyone wants to follow up on that, go onto Facebook,
David
go to the
McGuinness, something for you, Mum.
X2 page, and you can see the petition. I can also give you a link later on, maybe after this, to the actual petition page. Don't read what I'm yittering on about. Read what the senior researcher for the Parliament said, because it's her words that say, if you get this wrong, it's unlawful and it can be struck down. That's my bombshell for today, Dave.
So there you go, David McGuinness and David Milligan. That's something that you'll really enjoy. Was 2014 actually was IndyRef actually a legal referendum? Something for you to think about.
I'd love to get David McGuinness on. Got an awful lot of time for David. Very first meeting I ever spoke, I was asked to speak at a meeting years ago now. And David was in the audience. It was a good meeting. And it was the first time I spoke openly. I spoke with Andy Anderson on the subject of currency. And the one person that could pick me up on what I was saying, right or wrong, was David. And in Oban, at the March in Oban, outside the pub, David and I had a wee chat. And I said, David, you and I need to have another wee discussion about this because people are confusing currency and money. David understood what I meant. And at the last gathering at Holyrood, I asked David if he would help me with this and have a discussion with me. So we should maybe try and get David on at some stage, Dave.
Yeah. Talking about money. Joanna Cherry was in the press this morning, and that Yoon half of the National in the Herald, but seemingly she was causing a bit of a stushy up in Orkney.
Yep.
But like she had a few things to say about currency in the SNP conference last year.
She was saying it was stage managed.
Yeah, makes you wonder, eh?
Well, the person that spoke against what was basically the Growth Commission is a person called Dr. Tim Rideout. And he was meant to be doing a tour of Scotland talking about it. Now, it gets into an involved situation, but I'll pick up one thing that Tim Rideout says we need for a Scottish currency, which is a payment system. Last catch-up we did, I said I was working towards seeing whether we could create what I would call a yes economy. We already know, Dave, there's going to be people who haven't got any money. It's already happened.
Yeah.
How do you keep an economy going without any money? There's going to be people who are wanting to go back to work to find out their boss doesn't want them back to work because the firm that they were working for has gone bust. Small economy, it's gone bust. America's the best example. Trump's now looking at 20 million people signed up for unemployment benefit. I mean, 20 million.
Yeah.
Right? That's going to happen in Scotland. So is there a way in which, I'll backtrack a wee bit. Part of what I've done, it's on my phone, is a payment system. Now, the only person that's seen the detail of that is Peter Steele. And we should say a thank you to Peter for setting this up, the round table. I've messaged Peter to say we now need to have a very serious discussion because if we've got a payment system, how do we operate it without money? Now, in normal circumstances, and this is a thing I get involved in maybe about 20 years ago, in normal circumstances, a payment system handles money. But the system on that phone that I've got doesn't also handle money payments. It can also handle what are called LETs, which is a local exchange trade system, where you actually do it without money. You do it without debt. Now, I won't go into the detail of that, but Peter and I are going to have a very, very serious discussion. If you remember last catch-up, I mentioned Sandra Culbert makes the most brilliant tablet. Can that be
She went for advertising for her.
can that be exchanged for Lyle Duff fixing their car at some stage without having money involved? The problem with doing the payment system with money is you have to go to a regulator. I'll finish this very quickly. You have to go to a regulator in London. And that's a bit like the sides I was talking about in the legal system.
Yeah.
May not be that the payment system you're asking for approval from a payment systems regulator and then the Financial Conduct Authority. It may not be that they can object to it, but they could take months and months and months to approve it, right? They could just make it so difficult. The local exchange trading system does not require regulatory approval. So maybe we get a few people together and we show how it can be done. So people without money can still survive. It won't deal with your Asda shopping. I'm not going to suggest it ever will. But people have skills. I've got some favorite phrases. One of them is everyone in the Yes movement knows something, but not one of us knows everything. So you put up a test bench and you say, right, bring your specific knowledge, bring what goods or services you may be able to offer to the Yes community. And let's see if we can set up a system which doesn't require money to be involved.
Yeah.
But which will demonstrate that if it needs to be a separate independent currency in Scotland, the system already exists and can switch overnight from an exchange system into a money system. And do it before independence. Do it as one of the actions the Yes movement can come together, knowing it's highly unlikely that Ruth Davidson's ever going to get involved. Sorry, that was a big ramble, Dave, but it's one of my pet. I came on to this talking about currency. I can't get off the soapbox.
Aye. You've left me lost for words for a minute.
Well, let me give you the words. When we were talking earlier in the week, you wanted to have a go at me about Devo Max and sharecropping.
Yes.
Have a go at me. You have the ramble this time.
Okay, right. Basically, what Mike says to me, I think he said it on here last week, was that worst case scenario, if Nicola went to Boris and Boris, instead of saying no, like Groundhog Day, he turned around and says, okay, you can have your referendum, but it's not going to be independence or the status quo. It's going to be independence or Devo Max. And that might hit it might hit the yes vote. Certainly, it might hit some very soft yesers who just would like the safety blanket of slavery. Slaves get used to their chains. And anyway, basically, I was interested in an article that I read about slavery in America. When slavery was abolished, the cotton farmers and all the other stuff they do, peanuts or whatever it is, like they had nobody to harvest their stuff because the slaves had been freed. So like they were in danger of going bankrupt because they had all the land and they had all the product, but they had nobody to pick. So what they did was they leased out land to the freed slaves, and with the condition that the slaves would then pay them a part of the crop, usually the majority of the crop, for the use of the land, which basically meant you had a lot of black people working the land for like the right to work the land, and they got fed for it. So they were still slaves. Not only that, but the white people had the money, so they released the money in loans that had to be repaid at the end of the year under bad conditions. So that at the end of the day, they were only able to pay their debt at the end of the year. Then they had to go into a new year to pay to start it all again. So basically, all these people who are now free men were still slaves who were doing exactly the same job, and they were getting the same thing. The only thing is they wouldn't get their foot chopped off if they run away. And that was so basically an article that I read said that it's sharecropping is just slavery. And I took that a bit further because you can see the sort of way that you put it down into our situation, where Westminster are taking all the money that we make and they're giving us some pocket money back and a big slice of debt that they were never going to be able to clear back. So you think, well, okay, we're being sharecropped on our own land, but what is actually making it work is devolution. It's devolution. So sharecropping is another word for slavery, and I would say devolution is another word for sharecropping, because that's exactly what devolution does. It's a sharecropping arrangement with the landowner. Sorry, with the landowner in Westminster, and until we actually say, "Well, a minute, this is our land. It's not yours." It's not going to be done, and that would be how I would put the Devo Max thing to bed. It's like you can't be a bit of a slave. You're either a slave or you're a free man. Don't be a sharecropper, because a sharecropper's a slave.
I'll throw you another bit in of back to that history, and it wasn't just in the cotton fields that happened. It happened in the mining industry in America and elsewhere. The owner of the land or the field or whatever it was would pay the free, inverted commas, slaves currency. They would pay them in wages. They issued their own currency. But there was only one place they could spend that currency, and that was in the mine owner's or the slave owner's shop.
Yep.
So he created his own wee economy, right? You can work as hard as you have to work to earn the money to spend with me. I'll take the profit. That's where I was watching an American TV interview this morning, and they had an economist on, and he used two examples. He was asked what was going to happen if the virus managed to clear itself, and he talked about the second phase of it and whether it would clear. And he wasn't a medical expert, but he was trying to work his way through it as an economist. And he said, well, look, what he was asked was, would the bounce back look like a V? Sharp down and bounce back up again. And he said, well, there's two extremes to it. On one extreme, and he used a very good example for me, he used the example of Paris as a city, because in August, everyone leaves Paris. The whole of Paris closes down and they all go for holidays elsewhere. Now, everyone in Paris knows that's going to happen. So restaurants close, shops close, everything closes. A month later, everyone comes back to Paris and the whole thing starts up again. And he said, that's maybe what might happen. Maybe we'll get a complete bounce back. He then went to the other extreme and he said, roughly what I was talking about earlier on, firms will go bankrupt. People will not have an income. If people don't have an income, they won't be able to consume, they won't spend. So people that are running firms are saying, well, there's no point us opening again or producing again because people aren't spending the money. Two, there's a lot of people, because of the system and currency based in debt, there's a lot of people sitting with loans at the moment or car leases who, if they don't have a job, are suddenly going to be confronted with the fact, we can't pay this. There's people renting homes. Now, the ban on landlords evicting people is going to stop very shortly. I think it comes to a close at the end of this month. I hope it gets extended. So it could be one great big shit heap where no one can predict exactly what's going to happen. That was his view. Either you're going to have a quick bounce back or it's going to go on. And his comment was, it won't go on for a year. It won't maybe even go on for a few years. It could go on for decades.
Yeah.
That's why I come back to the yes economy bit. That's where I sit down and say, is there a small thing we can do where you can actually exist without money? Your sharecropping analogy is perfect, Dave. I did a clip, and I know you wanted me to refer to this. It was something the National did.
Yeah.
And I'm not a techie. I edited it, so it's not a brilliant edit. The first thing you've got is Theresa May saying, you can't have a union unless the people consent to it. So I'm agreeing with Theresa May, a Tory.
Yeah.
The next thing you've got is David Davis coming on. At the time, he was the guy that was in charge of Brexit. And he said, I don't know of any treaty anywhere in the world that you can't leave because the other side said so. So I'm agreeing with David Davis, a Tory. And then most importantly, you've got Geoffrey Cox, who at that time was being beaten over the head by the Tory Brexiteers about the backstop that was being discussed at the time. And he just said, no, look, as circumstances change, you've got every right to back out of what you've agreed to. It's not a question that you're forced to stay in. That brings me on to the meat of what I wanted to try and do today. And I may end up talking too much, but we've got Christine Graham saying, get out on the streets. You've then got this phrase UDI. I see it a slightly different way. We're in this position because someone way back in time, back to the future time, signed a treaty. Not the ordinary people of this country, the people who were actually trying to work out how to look after themselves. There was a treaty started, 1707. What we should be doing is rescinding that treaty, cancelling it, withdrawing from it, just saying, look, it's run its course. There's enough people in Scotland no longer agree with it. We should rescind it. Now, there are different ways of dealing with that. Now, this is where your knowledge is greater than mine. You know how Kosovo went about rescinding the treaty with Serbia and becoming an independent country. Would you like to talk through that, Dave, please?
Yeah, well, they didn't have a treaty with Serbia. They were part of Yugoslavia. But when I think originally when Yugoslavia split up, it split up into Serbia, Croatia, and I believe Montenegro was the third part at the time, and Kosovo was still part of what was Serbia at the time. The Serbs claimed it, but basically the Kosovans got together a People's Council. And rather than making it a unilateral declaration of independence, the People's Council contacted the International Court of Justice and asked them for a preliminary ruling as to whether, if they made a unilateral declaration of independence, it would be legally acceptable. And it took almost 3 years for it to be done. But basically, it went through all sorts of things. The International Court of Justice contacted literally hundreds of other countries. And the only two countries that actually voted against it were Serbia, for obvious reasons,
yeah,
and Spain, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But the most interesting one of them all was the UK, and I've actually seen the letter that they sent. It's quite a long letter, but the UK actually said in the letter it could have been written by Alex Salmond. It was so pro Kosovo independence of Serbia. There was no way they were looking at it through any context as Scotland and England or Scotland and the UK. I can't remember the exact specifics off the top of my head, but they were so for it, and it was done by the representative. I believe that the UK had a representative to the court. He was a sergeant, and he did it, and it was full on for that Kosovo had fulfilled all the necessary things to be a nation state, and Scotland have got so much more than Kosovo had. It took 3 years, and eventually the International Court of Justice said, our ruling is that you would be accepted. The following day, the council of Kosovo declared independence, and that was it. It was job done in one day. And people keep going on about this UDI thing. That's a bad thing. If I can go back a wee bit in history,
Yep.
like, and I'll go back to something that was British at the time. Let's go back to Ireland. And I know people don't like talking about Ireland because of the violence and all the rest of it. But how Ireland got their independence was they had the uprising in 1916. Well, Britain was at war, and they took an advantage when basically their attention was elsewhere. And the uprising started in 1916. There was quite a lot of violence. There were 400 people killed, and there were some people basically executed by the British. The uprising didn't last very long, but the actual act of the uprising made the political will for 2 years later for Sinn Féin to walk it in the elections in 1918. And basically, then the politicians followed up on what the people had done 2 years later and declared independence. And I'm starting to think that might be necessary for Scotland to go that way as well, because there is no political will other than waiting for our colonisers to give us permission. I think that we have the thing in Scotland that the Irish didn't have. The Scottish people are sovereign. Westminster admits that the Scottish people are sovereign. If the Scottish people can get together for one day without fighting with each other and say, right, okay, we're all going to gather down the front of that parliament, the lot is, and we're going to say, we're going to follow Christine Graham with one voice and say, look, we are demanding that Scotland is recognised as an independent country, and not asking any permission for Westminster, not asking any permission for Holyrood. Holyrood are Westminster servants, and Westminster have got no right to us. We need to declare it ourselves, elect the Holyrood Parliament as our representatives rather than representatives of Westminster through the Scotland Act, empower them, and then get them to go to the ICJ and demand and ask for a preliminary ruling, as did Kosovo. Yep. And as I say, what are Westminster going to do about it? They're not going to send tanks in to run down 100,000 yesers. They're not going to do it.
Takes me back into Craig Murray, because Craig Murray often cites the position of Kosovo, Dave. When we get him on, that's something I want to explore. Can I have a wee ramble on the meat of my thinking? Right. As I say, you may not approve it, and a lot of people may not approve it. I've scribbled down some notes. We know, this is facts, and then I'll come to the questions. We know there's about 4 million people in Scotland who are allowed to vote. If you take the recent polls, we know 2 million might vote yes, 2 million might vote no. If it's 50-50, that's where we are at the moment. Come next May, unless it's postponed, and I'll come to that later, but come next May, there's an election for the Scottish Parliament. We each get 2 votes at that election. I'll come back to that again in a second. But from my involvement in some of the things that have been going on, we already know, number one, that the turnout at elections, even for the Scottish Parliament, tend to be around 50%. So the 2 million yesers, we might only get 1 million voting. And that's not far out of line with what actually happens. So the first thing we've got to do as a yes movement is find everyone who is yes and make absolutely, utterly sure they are registered to vote, and then get them to vote. That is the first crucial requirement, because unless we exercise our sovereign right to vote, then we're not speaking, we're just marching and shouting. We need to do something about it. Now, here is where I think I differ from you, but remember last week I did that pyramid thing?
Yep.
Let's assume that all 4 million people who can vote, vote. Let's assume that it's half and half. That 4 million goes to 129 people.
Yep.
That's it. Somehow or other, we've passed that volume of knowledge and desire and opinions down to 129 people.
Yep.
Now, I took part in discussions about this, and I said the most effective action we can take is to decide who those 129 people are. Because at the end of the day, if you've got an opinion from the Court of Justice, it then has to be implemented. And democratically and legally, it has to be implemented from within the Scottish Parliament. And that's within those 129 people. Now, back to the 2 votes thing. As of now, there's 129, 73 of them were elected directly on the constituency vote. 56 of them, making up the 129, came in the list vote. There's a huge debate. I know you're not keen in Bella Caledonia, but there's a huge debate going on in Bella at the moment under a title heading The New Party. And there's opinions all over themselves. The Greens are involved. The Gars situation has arisen. There's all sorts of discussion. Here's where I sit down, and it's kind of 2 questions. I'll think of my own current MSP when I say this. And I go back, I'll use my share button again. I'll go back to what Boris said. I'll just leave that up on the screen while I talk. Boris said if he's got a strong Conservative majority government, he's just guaranteeing that he'll always say no. Let's say that the First Minister of Scotland asks next year for a Section 30 and he says no. Let's say in 2022, the First Minister of Scotland asks for a Section 30 and he says no. That's the Groundhog Day I'm sitting down with. So here's the first question to my MSP. If it is clear that every time we ask for a Section 30, that the answer is going to be no, it's what I said last week. The no position is what I want to hear again. Partly for the Court of Justice, that we've asked and asked and asked. Not just that people who are yes can vote, but people who are equally opposed, who want to vote no, can vote. That's democracy, the right to vote. Denied that. So back to my MSP. If it is proven that Boris Johnson is going to maintain that position for the next 5 years and potentially for the next 10 years, unless Labour get back into power, and that is not looking likely as we sit just now. If he's going to maintain that position, would you, as my member of the Scottish Parliament, then decide on my behalf and behalf of all of your constituents who have voted you into the Parliament, would you please then instigate the process to go to the International Court of Justice and ask whether we can declare independence? If my MSP says, on your bike, Mike, I'm never, ever going to do that. I am a member of a party which is going to pursue Section 30 until we get a yes. I may decide not to vote for that MSP. I want someone who may well pursue Section 30 for the next couple of years. But when we get no in the next couple of years, I want to know what happens after that. That is particularly true when you start getting to the list vote, because the current position, a lot of people disagree with a lot of people in this. There's 2 views. There's a lot of views on it, but there's 2 distinct ones. SNP will always call for votes 1 and 2. Yet if you go to the results of the last election in 2016, and you use Glasgow as an example, the SNP got 100,000 votes. But the people that and lost 2 seats, the people that get elected, like Annie Wells, not just anywhere else, but there's a whole bundle, Labour and Conservative, were voted in with only 23,000 votes. We can't allow that to happen again, because they're going to vote in the Scottish Parliament come after next May if we let it happen again. They're not going to vote for a referendum, and they're certainly not going to vote for going to the International Court of Justice. We've got to change that. Here's my second question to my MSP. Let's say he's elected on, or he or she is elected on 100,000 votes on the constituency one, not on the list one. And I've asked him my first question, and he says, yes, Mike, if we get refused the Section 30 more than once again, I will help instigate a process that we go to the International Court of Justice. I want another provision built into this, is that the same constituents who elected him, who may then see him not fulfill that commitment, to be able to recall him.
Recall, yeah.
Okay, there's something, we're in a position, Dave, where we've been put into position because of a treaty. We've been put into a position on the Scottish Parliament voting system. I have no objection to a spread of votes to different voting systems in a normal, independent Scottish Parliament where everyone's views are able to be taken into account, and it will then end up in compromises right, left and centre, which I may disagree with. But that is a way to have a proper democratic system which allows for proportions, which allows for views to be taken into account. I watched Martin Keating's do a live stream the other day. He was on about paying carers. Martin has talked about maybe becoming a list MSP. And if Martin did that and he went full throttle on trying to get payments for carers and changing the system, I would vote for him. I would support him in that. There might be other people say, no, hang on a minute, we've got a bigger priority than that, Martin. That's how you should establish it. But it is not correct in the current situation where if your agenda is high for independence. Now I want to scroll down. Nicola wrote to Boris Johnson. I'll just let people read this. I won't scroll it quickly. And this is the reply that Boris sent to Nicola when she said, I want another Section 30. She wrote in December last year. I won't read it. I'll just let people read it as it goes down.
I thought you were going to do a Boris Johnson impersonation there.
Now, starting with the very first one, where he guaranteed the people that support him that he's never, ever going to say yes. That is what he wrote back to the First Minister. I cannot agree to any request for a transfer of power that would lead to further independence. And note the word, it's not in the singular, it's in the plural, further independence referendums. Boris Johnson wasn't lying in his foreword, Dave. That's Groundhog Day as far as I'm concerned.
Yep.
The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, then issued a statement following that. Now, again, I'll do this slowly. I can post this later, Dave, if anyone wants to see it in detail.
Well, the first two paragraphs are right enough. Unfortunately, then it goes off into cloud cuckoo land that, oh, if we keep going on about it long enough, eventually like the water will wear away the stone. Unfortunately, we don't have time to wear away a stone with water because they're going to have completely destroyed everything that we've got.
Right.
And 300 years to get.
I'll highlight the bit that's, I don't think, yes, I can. One thing, though, is clear. The people of Scotland will get the right to decide our own future in an independence referendum. The Westminster Union cannot be sustained without consent. Democracy will prevail. And it's the last sentence. The only question is how long it will take the Tories and the rest of the Westminster establishment to accept that inevitability. So how long are those on the march who want independence and want it now prepared? How long are they prepared to wait, Dave?
Well,
Groundhog Day.
It's Quebec.
I'll clear my share page. I can post it later.
As I say, like you saw what happened. You saw what happened with Quebec. As I say, like they kept them on and on, promising and promising, promising, and eventually the movement died under them. And basically Quebec's still part of Canada, and we have copied Quebec up to now. And at the end of the day, we don't want to go down that road, because if we do, we're dead. And at least Quebec got a second referendum.
Now, there's one other thing I want to raise, and I thank Peter Steele for setting this up, which is very simply, we have the digital covenant. You were talking earlier on, Dave, that we gather outside the Parliament building and we demand a request. We request politely. One,
I would invade the Parliament, take it over, and refuse to leave.
okay. The alternative to that is we register as yes supporters on the digital covenant, as individuals, as sovereign Scots, and we build the covenant up. It's got to at least reach 2 million. The same 2 million I'm saying we need to absolutely make sure we get registered to vote for next May. The one thing I want to finish on from my rant, if you like, is it is possible because of the virus that next May there will not be an election. If that turns out to be the case, and only when that turns out to be the case, would I suggest that we make my 2 questions. If you get refused time and time again, will you instigate the process to go to the International Court of Justice? We can ask our existing SNP MSPs that question. We can also ask the Greens that question, so that people who are required to vote and who put 129 people in charge of this country know exactly where they stand, times each of those 129, or if you like, just the SNP. We know that things are going to develop this year because of Alex Salmond, the book coming out, anonymity may be going, right? There's a whole bundle of things going to develop, Dave.
Yeah.
What I want to know, because I've only got 1 vote. Next year I've got 2 votes. I want to know who I'm voting for.
Yeah. And what you're voting for.
It's not whether I'm voting SNP.
Yeah.
Right? This comes back to the old argument whether it's party or independence.
Yeah.
It's not. It's independence times the MSP that will do what I think I want to vote for.
Exactly.
Okay. That's my rant over. Come the revolution.
Yeah, well, basically, I think that's pretty much all I've got to say as well. It's like the one thing that we can't do is sit and allow them to consolidate like anything that they've done. And if we sit and try to consolidate, basically we're taking a step backwards. We've had another poll there where we're not behind, and as I say, like it's difficult. So I hear these people saying that we're on 75% and all the rest of it, but we're in social media bubbles. There are other places to think we're not. But I'm happy to accept that we're pretty close in the polls, but we don't have a campaign. And I think that the SNP like should be absolutely front. I mean, the only people that are not talking about independence are the party that are supposed to be there for independence. And as I say, I've written to my MSP already.
I know that. Yeah.
And I've asked the questions. I've not had a reply yet, but I'll get one because I know that his assistant is much more round to my way of thinking than my MSP is. So if you're listening, Ben, I'm waiting.
One of the things I thought of doing, Dave, I've had my rant, right? I am not in the slightest disrespecting Nicola Sturgeon,
No,
right? I'm not disrespecting the SNP. I just want to be able to wake up one day and know that we're going to take action to achieve independence, not going on march year after year shouting for it without it actually being accomplished. One of the thoughts I have is whether maybe on your page, maybe Peter Steele can do something, is we set up a poll which outlines the two questions I'm talking about. If we keep getting refused, will you ask your MSP about going to the Court of Justice?
yeah.
Do you think it's a good idea if he says yes and then doesn't do it, that we should be able to recall him? And I think the yes movement on a poll could indicate how they feel about that. Maybe they agree with me, maybe they disagree with me. Let's find out. Do a poll within the yes movement. My friend, you and I go off at tangents. Thanks for letting me have a bigger tangent maybe today. Always enjoy your company, Dave.
Spoke to Craig.
We'll be back, friends.
Okay, thanks for listening, guys. As I say, like we're throwing stuff in the water. These are things for you to talk about. We're not trying to tell you what you need to do or what to think. We have ideas, we throw them out there, and what we're trying to do is provoke discussion among yous. That you've all got better brains than we've got, and as I say, like it's a question of getting the best out of these and putting them together and moving us forward. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you later.
Ciao, Alba.
Cheers.